This is Andy Weinstein, founder and CEO of Godot and host of What Are You Waiting For? A podcast by Godot. We have today a very special guest, Nigel Sharp. He is a hybrid professional who's done business in and worked with startups, particularly in the deep tech space, just kind of like what Godot is embarking on now. We're really excited to have you on board. Nigel, can you give us a little summary of you and what you're doing and what you're working on?
Hey Andy, yes, super glad to be here. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Well, I have a bit of a mixed history, but in short, been a three times founder, two B2B SaaS companies with varying different technologies, and then most recently a clean tech hardware company that was tackling these toxic contaminated wastes called PFAS, the forever chemicals, and have had a chance to live in sort of six different countries, travel the world building both startups and businesses, and then spend a lot of time mentoring and consulting sort of in the startup space as well, both for accelerators and then directly to various startups. So just like live, breathe, and I've done startups for most of my career at this point. I really love this space. Other than that, the accent that people are hearing on the call is originally from London, but has been washed away as I've moved around more. Now being in the US about 10 years, and yeah, life day to day is either being a dad up in sort of the Seattle Tacoma area, and apart from being a dad, I get to hang out and like talk to people with the startups, which are kind of like their babies and what they're doing with them.
Awesome. So let me ask you a very simple question. What got you into this space? Like, what was your coming out of college or going into college? Was there like a moment that you had this aha moment, or has it been kind of like me, this journey that is putting these pieces together of life experiences and realizing in the rearview mirror, oh, this is a coherent path, but during the process, it was totally incoherent.
Yeah, I love the retrospective question because it's really interesting to look back now at like a older stage of life and then notice myself when I was my daughter's age. My daughter's like, almost 10. And I remember like going on my first entrepreneurial experiences around that age, right? I think a lot of us have those kind of experiences, a lemonade stand or something similar. And what I ended up doing, I remember like when I was, baking some cookies and cakes and selling them door to door with some friends initially. But quickly expanded and got involved in a couple of like very young entrepreneurial program things that were kind of attached to the schools, and I was in these sort of competitive environments and really enjoyed that. Right, you had like a little mini trade show booth and actually like built a product. And I remember like getting a product into a retail store. I'm around sort of 12 years old, and then in the midst of my early teen years. I also started like a little like manufacturing welding company because I learned how to weld, and then like I'd make little brackets and things for people, and that turned into like a little business because I got to make and fix gates on people's property. And yeah, you start realizing that, oh, I guess I've been doing this entrepreneurship thing for quite a while. But then, school and college will kind of beat a lot of that out of you, and you start thinking about getting a regular career. And I did end up with a couple of degrees in engineering and a master's in science at King's College London, but still always had this sort of entrepreneurial drive. And they had a university entrepreneurial competition called Lion's Den, and the Lion's Den was kind of loosely based on the Dragon's Den, which is the UK equivalent kind of Shark Tank, to put things in context. And I remember like doing that program and getting really jazzed by it. But again, went off to work for a little bit and got involved in an organization that rapidly grew. I guess it really was kind of a social enterprise and a rapidly growing one, so kind of a social startup enterprise, and focused on like kids' education and technology. And the whole thing culminated in like 3 or 4 weeks where I got a chance to go to a TEDx event, got a chance to go to a sort of startup weekend, and I got a chance to go to a meeting of tech business people. And these 3 weeks, all I heard was, you should just, if you've got ideas of things you want to do, if you think you can make bigger difference in the world, go do it. This is the moment to start something. And I felt very inspired after those couple of weeks, and I decided to like leave my day job at that point, which was around 2012. And really, for the last 13 years or so, I've done nothing but startups ever since. And then in that time, I've started three venture-backed sort of startup companies, but also have mentored and engaged with about 450, 500 different other companies over that period as well.
Wow. You basically learned that you had the entrepreneurial spirit because you couldn't stop finding, I don't want to say money making opportunity, but commerce making opportunities, whether it's welding or whatnot, and then you finally had the opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit about that first startup that you got into and the startup experience that clearly kicked off a career?
Yeah, and I'll clarify one thing at the beginning there. I don't think it was commerce or money driven was the big goal initially. That was never it's never really been a big interest of mine. I think I've always been kind of a technologist at heart, right? Like it's that geek in me, or that nerd in me that likes those things out there to try and figure out how they work. And then you start putting things together and you can do stuff that other people think is quite complex, right? Back in those early sort of like teen, preteen years, like building websites was still something you could really make money doing, if you had some of those skills. And it was a very different experience back then than it is, for example, now. Um, and so yeah, I think the motivation was always like technologies drew me in. And so my first company, and when I talk about like company, I mean sort of startup company and then high growth potential, really started with me like taking all that inspiration from these guys and saying like, what I really want to do is I want to create like an IT consultancy. I'd just been an IT project manager for this last large project in a country called Armenia. The name of that project is called Tumo. It's a creative technology center for teenagers basically. So they teach digital media, game design, web design, animation. Coming out of that and like getting inspired to start my first startup and actually like going on my own journey. Um, was I want to like take all this IT skill that we've just learned and like apply it forward, but because I see new technologies coming about, and I got really inspired by certain things. You probably remember the Xbox 360 ability to sort of like use gesture and voice control to control things. This was sort of pre-Siri age, but we were still at that Dragon naturally speaking phase where we could like use voice to input into computers. So I was pretty excited about like human computer interaction at that point. That was like a big area of technology that I was excited about. I was seeing a lot of things in that space. And so that was what our first company did. It was a company called Lion Sharp, and the name of the product became VoiceBoard. And the core idea was that we were working on a whiteboard one day and we got really frustrated with the whiteboard that we couldn't just like talk to the whiteboard and things wouldn't just appear as we needed to. Like if I wanted to see a picture of the Eiffel Tower, I should be able to just ask a whiteboard, show me a picture of the Eiffel Tower, put it up on the screen, and I should be able to move it around with my hands like you naturally would if you were working or drawing something. So kind of like a really interactive, if you imagine like a Minority Report or Jarvis in Iron Man kind of does that. That was kind of the vision. Um, yeah.
Do you want to? I just want to do a pause there for a moment because I think whiteboarding is actually a space that needs a lot of innovation. I love whiteboarding. Tend to go to conferences with a fold up whiteboard in my pocket. Today, I had a meeting, for example, pulled out my foldable whiteboard and was able to kind of simply draw simple things, and sometimes you can convey complexity with simple drawings in a whiteboard, but it requires it coming from you. And so you were thinking about it as, how do I talk to my whiteboard to have the things that my hand dexterity can't do? Or don't want to interrupt my mind while I'm doing it, right? Because I think that's another piece is you lose concentration by writing, and in many cases you can ruin it. So your technology, if I understand this correctly, was to essentially turn a whiteboard into almost like a two-way panel, right? A TV, a display, and a device to write upon. And how big did that business get? And how many people were on your team?
So yeah, that was more or less the original idea. We were sitting on the sofa and getting tired of having to get back up with a whiteboard pen and get on the board. And also the whiteboard is never big enough, right? So there was all that kind of challenge. And by the way, I want to put this in context. This was back in like 2012. You didn't have the online software tools that now exist to do some of this like digital whiteboarding work, and you didn't have and you had the smart boards were in schools and things, but again, they were expensive and a bit clunky. And what we wanted was the ability to like just talk to it, like work with it, like Jarvis in the Iron Man kind of movie. So we built it, by the way. We built that tool, VoiceBoard, and we ended up like being way ahead of our time. I gave the world's very first voice and gesture controlled TEDx presentation. So we kind of pivoted a little bit and moved into becoming a presentation software where people could use their hands and their voice while presenting to showcase things up on a screen as they're presenting. And that was pretty exciting. And it won a number of different sort of national championships, the Imagine Cup from Microsoft. We got engaged in various sort of like different country competitions and awards, and we took venture money in Bulgaria and in Armenia primarily, and then we ended up sort of opening up an office in Boston. So we ended up becoming sort of spanning three countries between Bulgaria, Armenia, and the US. And I think at our peak we're about 22 people, just to give you some context of size. And we ran that company for about two and a half years, close to 3 years. Um, and the end output of that company is real founder learnings of that we were way ahead of the market. If you had asked me by 2020, especially with a pandemic on the potentially there, if we would still be using keyboards and mice, I would have bet every asset that I own that keyboards and mice would be dead by 2020 back then. Like, that's where I was living in technology back at that stage in my life. Um, I have become a lot more mature in understanding that like technology adoption is vastly slower. And so what really happened next was like Siri became sort of more mainstream. People started like engaging with voice, in the Siri, but we were doing stuff far more advanced than Siri does. And now people are starting to do that sort of stuff with ChatGPT and going like, oh, that's really cool. But it's interesting it's taken that long to sort of get to mainstream when we knew that technology was there over a decade ago, right? This isn't something that's just happened. This has been there for a long time. It just takes a long time for stuff to cross into the main market. So the
Oh,
company, unfortunately, ran out of funding. We didn't hit product market fit. We struggled to raise some more money, and so I can get into any kind of part of the story that you really want. But broadly speaking, first startup, a lot of learnings. But the big thing is like being ahead of the market, timing it wrong. Sometimes technology for the sake of tech, when we had other opportunities we could have pursued, was really interesting. But we built a company doing deep neural networking, stuff that was like the precursor of a lot of AI now, doing advanced, gesture and voice controlled computing using, various cameras, microphones, and different types of speech engines and gesture engines to see what people were doing. It was really cool. And like, yeah, the videos like still look pretty futuristic now. But it was interesting that, way ahead of its time.
yeah, no, I can imagine. I had an animation and video production studio in 2012 and 2013 called Digital Workshop. And at that time, we were looking at remote computing for rendering these images and videos. And I did not realize the value of that until my animators were like, "Oh, you just render the video while we continue working." And I said, "Sure." And my computer was a brick for a week. Um, and it sounds like what you were trying to do was essentially markerless motion tracking. And that is something that the Xbox Connect brought out, but I really think the let's say the mass adoption was the Wii. And the reason why it worked so well with the Wii was because it dumbed down cool technology things into a simple process that says, "Do you want to play tennis or bowl against your friends?" Um, and and that is a barrier that sometimes we forget. We try to think of the coolest way to use tech versus the simplest way that everybody will understand.
Yeah, Andy, where were you in my life, 10 years ago? Because I mean, if someone had just come in and shaken me by the neck and said, like, "Look, listen, like, just because because we were using Microsoft Connect quite heavily at that point, for
Mhm.
our initial gesture, but then you try and sell that to a real business or a customer and say, like, you need to install this in a room when you go give a presentation and plug it into this and do that." And people are like, "What do I do with this wire? Where does this go? How do I? This doesn't work." And then we're like, "No, no, you got to face it this way. You can't face it directly against a window because that's going to throw off the camera, etc., etc." Right? And it was like a nightmare. And then we did at the very end of the company pivot to basically creating a phone controller that would use a phone and kind of like a Wii controller, kind of use the accelerometer in a phone to kind of like act that way. And it was a lot simpler because people could then just press a button on their phone and hold it. Although before we didn't have any phones, you could just use your hands naturally, right? But the reality was is that people wanted that interstitial technology between the two. And as you said, the Nintendo Wii and like some other technology sort of came about. We had actually transitioned over to like a ring that you'd wear that is similar to some of the new sort of rings that are out there now, but a ring that would be able to track motion as well. Anyway, I mean, it felt very advanced for the time. We were solving, but it felt like it was going to happen any moment. And the reality of technology is that we're still at a point in the world that even post a pandemic, we would touch screens when everybody else is touching them, or do other things. Like it's still fascinating that it takes a long, long time for technology to get fully adopted by the masses. So.
And I'm gonna do a quick pivot to something that is semi related, but I think you and I can agree that venture capital is marketed as like the people that invest in innovations. And historically, that's been true if it's led by DARPA and not true everywhere else, right? So I'd love to get your perspective of going through the venture process. And also, how did you end up in Bulgaria, of all places, to get funding? Was that a VC or an individual?
Okay, well, a couple of good questions there. Let's start with the Bulgaria piece because it ties into the whole story. So, we were in Armenia when we started the company on my living room and sofa, but Armenia did not have a VC or anything at that point. Armenia was still a young country relatively, maybe 20 years at that point when it had broken up from the Soviet Union. And they did not have kind of any inherent VC. There was a few angels around for sure, but it was still very, very nuanced. And we were the very first venture funded company backed in Armenia, but we couldn't get money from Armenia, so we went to Bulgaria to get it. And Bulgaria at that point was spinning up the 11 fund, which was funded under the European Innovation Fund, the EIF money that had come out. And that was a fairly large amount of money that funded a lot of the accelerators and everything back in the sort of like, mid 2010 kind of era, 2010, 2015 realm. Like there was a lot of funding flowing around Europe to like kind of create more accelerators, and we were able to sort of like benefit from some of that accelerator investment money. So yes, they were a venture capital accelerator fund that has grown considerably since then. There's been a couple of offshoot funds from that, but we were there at the very early stages of Bulgaria's ecosystem, and they're at the absolute beginning stages of the Armenian ecosystem. And yeah, quite the dichotomy. And then we would fly over to like Boston, and of course, Boston being a much more robust, established ecosystem, we would have really impressive technology. People would be blown away at how much technology we had for how little we had spent. But we'd also learned to be really frugal, from having built businesses in like, developing parts of the world. And then going out of Boston, like, money was a very different thing. And so, yeah, to bridge over to the VC question, I I hear you that like we didn't know what we didn't know back then, and like really, I think I was kind of enamored by the fact this industry even kind of existed. But in Europe and the countries I had been in, like Bulgaria and Armenia, it was all very very new, very nascent. And then you come over to places like Boston, and you go in and like there'd be like VC meetings, and the floor above you, you just go in and like talk to somebody, and they would ask you a bunch of questions, but it was very off putting because it was like, well, don't you want to see the cool technology we have? And they were like, yeah, yeah, I do. But then, they would kind of get lost in like, what is the business? What is this? And what, where are the metrics going? And we didn't understand exactly what they were talking about. But you realize that they have a very specific look of what they're trying to sort of develop and create. And, they have a limited boundary on like, what they can invest in their portfolios and their particular sort of theses. All of that was very new to me back then. And I think in the last decade or so, especially being in the US, I've learned a lot more about how this industry truly works, at least from that side, and how it doesn't work as well for a lot of deep tech. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think when we talk about deep tech, right, it's really hard for the costs for physical things to go down. If you need to build a thing that has 1,000 tons of steel, it has 1,000 tons of steel, right? There's no way around that piece. So I'd love to hear from your perspective in working with so many startups in the deep tech space. How do you navigate the different perspective of VCs that want not capital intensive hockey sticks versus people that are building the infrastructure that are less hockey stick and more capital intensive?
yeah, I mean, like that's a really great area. So, Andy, I guess the way I see VC and deep tech is that it is an emerging space. Truly, I think historically there was a moment where that's where initial VCs got their original funds and did some really great things back in the sort of like 70s and 80s. But they kind of lost that side of that. When software came along, there was just a big focus on, hey, we could just invest in the next little like software optimization for this business process, for that business process. And a lot of that's kind of happening now, kind of on another sort of trend again around like sort of AI and where that sort of ties in. And yet, what gets lost in that is there are like hard things that need to get done, and sometimes those hard things also require hardware. And I think what you're talking about is really like the commodity cost of hardware doesn't really go down. There's a real cost to working in the physical world and being part and present in the physical world. Um, and so that's very real. And unfortunately, when it comes down to dealing with the technical risk and dealing especially with hardware or deep tech hardware, that is something that most VCs do not want to bite off or chew. Like that is just not something there's a lot of appetite for. There are a few, right? And there's increasingly some more funds in the last few years that have been sort of growing in that focus area. Um, Most notably, like maybe the MIT has a really great program called the Engine, and their funds associated with that. And like they've really sort of created a great thesis and have some great resources for anyone who wants to read about it on their website around like what hard tech really means and how that sort of thesis can work in investing in that space. And they've really grown a lot of their funds to focus on that. So I really admire that there is some increased effort here, but broadly speaking, it's still a fraction of what really gets put into sort of venture capital in general. And it's not usually awfully trying to mitigate technical risk. Often the money is going to mitigate like commercial risk. So they want to help you scale, market, build partnerships, etc. But to mitigate technical risk, they want somebody else's dollars to do that. And really what that ends up being, for the most part, at least in the US, is have you got enough like government dollars to help you with that, right? And that's government grants, various contracts that you can maybe get in those different things, both state and federal. Um, Classically, there's a famous program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR program, and that is a big source of like initial and early capital for those deep tech hardware companies. Like without that, a lot of them would not even get off the ground.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that scares a lot of people in the current climate is the fact that those federal dollars that VCs depended on for their deep tech and their hardware investments are gone. So VC needs to step up to the plate. And we're just not seeing that because their portfolios are not delivering the returns, right? And how do you see that gap that previously was government, which had its role essentially to fit between the microeconomics and the macroeconomics and the inefficiencies between the two take hold? Who's our knight in shining armor?
Yeah, I'm going to take maybe some contention with that. I don't know if that's an accurate or fair statement to say that the money's gone. Like I haven't seen that, and I mean I'm engaged with a lot of this community, and I genuinely haven't seen a lot of the federal dollars dry up for early stage deep tech innovation. Like I still feel that money is still very much there. There is some base level science research funding that has like been pulled away, but that stuff is like pre technology. That's kind of like that science level stuff at universities. But at the innovation funding, like the SBIR kind of things, I don't think any of those programs have really been heavily like impacted. The focuses may have like shifted a little bit, so there may be some like shift in focus. There may not be as much of a focus on climate, and there may be some more focus on like where the technologies. But that makes sense. This is a government funded program where the priorities of where innovation and research wants to go towards commercial activities has to be towards the priorities of the country. But it's a shift and not so much like a detraction. So I think like it's an adaptation problem of like startups having to figure out how to adapt to yes, changing market conditions, but
Well, I think some of the startups that have secured funding have already have that kind of bucketed, but it's a lot of the people that would be applying for funding or were building business models that were dependent are a little fearful that if they're dependent on government funding, they're not going to get it. So I think one of the areas from a funding perspective that is kind of under talked about is the role of family offices. Did
mm.
you work with any family offices on any of your startups?
Yeah, we did. So actually, the first company I was talking about, the largest investor we ended up bringing in actually was a family office. I guess I can be fairly public about it and say like we worked with the Hovnanian Foundation, who are a pretty wealthy real estate family office based over sort of New Jersey, New York area. They were our largest investor in that first company that did the voice board, gesture and voice controlled computing stuff. Yeah, and so like had some direct experience, getting an investment through them, but they found it, it was very atypical for them. They had not done a lot of investments like that, so they struggled a little bit without some external advisory to understand how to structure that term sheet and deal, and that was an equity based deal that we did in the end with them. I think things have got a bit more sophisticated, but I've also had a chance to like advise some various family offices over the years as doing diligence on certain companies, and often like I see them tapping in and tying into like angel networks where they can like maybe bring in some additional funds, they can see some deal flow through the angel network. And so yeah, I definitely see them sort of operate in that world. And there's no doubt that they are influential like players in the back of the back world. But I broadly count a lot of those family offices, the smaller ones for sure, as just kind of like part of the angel community in general. So
What's interesting is these family offices are becoming much more professional, right? From
Mhm.
where before you would have essentially a patriarch or a matriarch leading the investment and then the team saying, okay, how do I get capital to fund it? But they weren't acting so much as stage gates. And currently we're seeing a lot more family offices really professionalize and turn into multifamily offices or different type of organizations that actually are able to deliver more capital than your traditional corporates and faster because of it's one hierarchy point and everybody else follows, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
for decision making,
yeah.
totally. I've definitely seen, that's kind of the promise, right? Like, it's like, look, we can run this. There's a few of us in this family office. There's small, nimble organizations. I mean, most VC firms are as well, to be fair. But there's small, fairly nimble organizations that have to pass stuff up, and they might be have a single or a sole decision maker at the top end, which makes things relatively quick. Um, the only challenge I've seen often is that most of the smaller family offices will have like pretty consistent and like limited theses. They can't like take as much broad spread on this, and very few of them can engage in things like deep tech, for example. And like that's what I've seen like consistently is because they don't have the technical sophistication to understand how to do diligence on a deep tech deal, so they can like co-invest along like a lead investor who can do that diligence work. But there's still a place for the people that got the time to do the diligence work for these harder deals to understand, especially when you've got a complex technology that needs to be sort of understood and there has to be some diligence done on that. It makes it harder for a smaller family office that doesn't have sophistication. But things are changing, right? Like with the advent of AI, research tools, and other things that sort of available to them, as well as like the democratization of more and more startup information through PitchBook and Crunchbase, etc. That they have more tools available to them, so that small nimble teams can still make outsized performance based investments. Again, I'm not like too directly in that space, but I think it is they're at more of an advantage than historically they had because they can utilize some of those tools. But you've got to be really careful in what you're utilizing, right? If you do your technology diligence using ChatGPT, you're bound for trouble when it comes to deep tech.
Yeah, I laugh reflexively of using AI as a research tool, despite the fact that I've built GBTs for myself based off of studies so that I can trust that at least to a certain point, right? I think the difficulty we're entering is there's going to be so much information that it's going to be hard to swim through what is true and what is fake, right? Or what is modified or what is regurgitated from an LLM. What do you really see as the solve to the trust factor that comes with AI? Like, do you see that there's going to be a solution out there, or do you think we're going to go back to pen and paper because AI has just flooded the digital realm too much?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I think that let's talk about this in like some context, right? Like startup context. Once upon a time, if you could put together a decent deck, you could go to an accelerator like 15 years ago, like I did, and raise money on just like a deck and a kind of fake presentation. Now you could have that same thing generated by AI in like literal minutes. So therefore, like what generates real opportunity now is traction. But what can you do? You can build fake looking things that like make it look like you've got digital persona and traction, and so then you do have the ability that some people can take advantage of that, but at the very core of this is like the ability for us to trust has to happen on two sides, right? It's the trust of the information, but it's also the trust of the various users that are engaging with that information, right? And so the integrity of personal trust becomes even greater in the community. If you can have more real people validating that you're real and you really know what you're talking about in that space, there's going to be inherent advantage there. Now the challenge with that, though, is the downside of that, right? Which is that we might have a young new entrepreneur who's got a brilliant idea, right? Let's say they're like in their late teens and they've got some brilliant idea. They've got access to all these amazing tools. They're able to build out some incredible stuff, and they've got some real traction. In the end, they may get dismissed because they don't have that social capacity and social capital built up yet. And so that inherently is what I think is that's how we solve a lot of this. Is that we have to like retrain ourselves that like sometimes we spend a lot of time learning all these skills and tools to do all this like hard work that now AI can like do for us really rapidly. but we're gonna have to retrain ourselves with school, soft skills and social capital skills to help like make sure that we still build human connections. Because in the end, if you're trying to raise money or sell to a customer, there's a human being at the other end still making a choice and decision, and like humans buy from humans, at least currently. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think that's a very good point. When you're talking about like the relationship capital, I think that is something that is really hard for a lot of people outside of, let's say, the Bay Area, New York, LA, Seattle, and Austin, right? Like we don't actually have that many epicenters that generate a lot of talent. Um, like those places, but when they do, it's hard for people to understand because they don't know, is are you king of a small hill or peasant of a big hill, right? Um, and so I'm wondering, when you're looking for startups and you said you've mentored somewhere between 450 to 500, where are these people located? And how do you validate their ability to deliver, not just on the technology side, but on the social capital, on the financial, et cetera, all those different components that go into a startup beyond just, do I have this best tool for this problem?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you're talking to me as if I'm an investor. I already look at really look at that work as like investor work. I have done it from a bit of an investor lens, but for the most time, I treat it as a true mentor lens. And for me, a mentor at the very core is somebody who can like relay and retell stories, both personally experienced and through other sort of life experiences and what they've seen, and relay these stories across in an effective way that somebody else can infer some lessons and maybe apply some of those lessons into themselves. So unlike an advisor or a consultant, right? I try and avoid like that. And I also like unlike a coach, I do some coaching as well. But those are much more direct. It's like you should do this, or like, hey, I want to help you work on this particular problem, right? That's where the advisor or the coach kind of falls in. As a mentor, I just spend my time mostly like telling the stories of like, well, I did this, and like this is what happened when I tried that, and that lesson and that sort of value learning, helps people find their own conclusions, and they can sort of like relay and like start building their own connections and patterns themselves within the startup realm. But of course, as I'm working with companies, I do sometimes go like, "Oh, I can see the problem you guys have here, like, and the problem might be like you, the founder. You're the problem, right?" And what I mean by that is that maybe they've got a real like communication challenge. Maybe they've got a real ability, inability to sort of like talk and like do math and numbers, whatever else it might be, or maybe it's something more fundamental that like they've got a belief in like some technology, but they've really got no background, like sort of dig into that. For example, I was just talking to one company about like a neuroscience type thing, and yet some of the other competitive companies have just three MBAs and a marketing person on their thing. They don't have a single tech person. They've got somebody who took one course at a university at one point in some sort of like neuroscience area, and that's how they're justifying this technology they're offering to the world. And you can pass that in front of any real tech people, and they just like sort of shirk at it. And like the last business I was in, we saw that in the market as well. That there was a big hot topic. A lot of people were drawn in to try and throw their tools at that problem, and we knew up front, like as people kept entering the market, like that doesn't work. Like they just haven't, they don't know that yet, but they're already promising they can solve the problem with their tool because it's worked for everything else. And we're specifically talking about like destroying toxic forever chemicals called PFAS, and like they thought they could do it with something else, and it's like, well, no, like you haven't read, you haven't read the studies, you don't really understand. That's not how it quite works, and you can destroy some of it. But that isn't what the customers need, et cetera, right? The nuance is important. That deep understanding is important, and that focus area of like deep technologists in deep tech is not going away anytime soon. And that is something you really look for in a successful team, at least in this space, is that you've got to have that technology capacity.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, I'm moving into a new space that is essentially deep tech. And I
Mm,
realized that I didn't just need an advisor, I needed redundancy in my advisors who are able to help me navigate the complexity associated. Because I don't know the oil and gas space, I don't know the energy space, but I also understand things at scale are very different, right? At scale, you're focusing on a multiplication problem, and
hmm
on a project, you're an purely addition problem. What is needed for this to go from 0 to 1 or 0 to continuous. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I realized helped me a lot was getting advisors and mentors who could provide similar experiences but different perspectives. So, an example, once I started to head down this waste to energy path, I reached out to a buddy of mine who was the lead of digital transformation at Saudi Aramco, Clinton Woods. And I also reached out to another buddy of mine who was the GM of finance at Chevron. And I could use their responses to see if first, am I insane? The answer tends to be yes, but that's okay. And then second, am I onto something that both of them get excited about it? And I started to realize, yes, that was really where I ended up getting the validation is because I'm solving not just a small problem, but a systemic problem. And for me, the systemic problem was really on the beverage side. How do I modernize and how do I diversify? I took that a step further and say, hey, every truck that sells Pepsi needs fuel, and if it's selling Pepsi, it needs water, carbonation, and some type of sweetener or flavor, right? That's essentially our business model. And so
Right.
if I could produce from the piles of waste from our own supply chain, the CO2 and the fuel and the water, now I'm just looking at the flavors that is somebody else's responsibility, and I can localize the production very well and evenly because I know these are customers that are ever present. But it requires really deep understanding of first the beverage ecosystem to know, first of all, that bottlers represent 10% of the food grade CO2 sold in a territory. Most people don't know that. I build in redundancy to help secure my expertise and make sure I'm on the right path, but going forward, as a lot of things are being done in AI, a lot of the steps are being missed that are actually the ways that we learn. And I really don't know the answer to this because I know growing up, everybody tells you not to touch the hot pot, but you don't learn until you touch the hot pot. How are we going to get to the next step with AI if we're not touching a hot pot anymore?
Yeah. Let's pass that apart a little bit. So I heard that we need to think about how do we get to the next step in general without having like learned and lived experiences. And so I think that is where you can leverage like mentors over advisors, right? And like really like hear some other people's stories and then like, recognize how that may or may not apply to your story and what you want to do. But I do agree with you, the world is changing really rapidly, and now you've got access to a even greater pool of like, experience and advice kind of like aggregated through big LLMs, like a chat GPT, and to bounce those kind of things off and get to think through things more thoroughly in that regard. And I think like you should absolutely be leveraging those tools. The danger is, those tools don't necessarily drive towards how you make that final decision. And there's a learning required and like learning how to fail and make decisions that don't work out, right? And so that is where real experience comes in. That even when we try and do things that are the best and most optimal suggested path, things don't work out for other reasons, right? Like we live in a chaotic environment in general, and so therefore we can't always predict the outcome, no matter how well some of us think that we've got a good grasp on it. And so I think that's kind of the reality is that leverage experience, right? People that have been there, done that, are going to be the best people to hold on to and like really sort of like hear their stories because they've gone through the trials and tribulations. You don't want to hear about people that have just had tons of success, but you want to have people like me on shows like this talking about like, hey, my first company, like grew to 3 countries, raised money, got a lot of interest, had a lot of applause, won tons of competitions, was exciting technology. It was also probably like 2 decades ahead of its time, or at least more than a decade ahead of its time. It, hadn't really solved the customer need, it didn't have some of the fundamental basics kind of down. In hindsight, this stuff sounds really easy, but at the time I hadn't internalized those learnings because I hadn't had that failure. People told me these things, but I just nodded my head. Um, but it's that moment when you have to look at your employees and you have to look at your co-founders and go like, guys, we're out of money. Like we can't, there's no more. We're at the end of the road here and like have to shut it all down. And you see the disappointment and stress that causes for people and their families. That's the moment that, no AI tool is going to be able to tell you how that feels and what that looks like. And how when I was sitting in the seat as the CEO, how that was a humbling experience in my mid 20s to sort of have, and to have to let go of friends and see their families and see the disappointment because they were looking to me to have that final, you know, pull it out of the hat solution, and there was nothing more I could do. And watching sort of like nothing but depression sink in all around as it was a really hard loss for us to sort of experience. Um, but from that, I vowed to not make those same mistakes again. I spent the time to learn and get myself better. And so we have to have those rough falls. We have to touch those hot pots. And we have to not be scared to be encouraging each other to do that and not just spending all our time theoretically imagining what it's going to take to do that, but actually get out there and just build things, right? And do stuff.
And I think you we touch about this as on quite a few discussions with startups where the question is, when do you pivot, and does your pivot, how markedly does your pivot change your business? And in many cases, as a startup founder, it is really hard to pivot because you feel like you're giving up in many cases.
Mm,
And you're also figuring out that you have to explain to your investors, hey, we see this path being more fruitful than the other. I obviously went through a massive pivot this year or in 2023 when I decided to explore waste to energy from selling essentially toilet paper and Pepsi trucks. Um, Most people did not see the relationship between the two. I first saw it. I basically saw it as I started by trying to fill a Pepsi truck on the way out. Then I saw the opportunity to fill it on the way back when it can be used as a backhaul capacity to collect things. And then once I got it to my warehouse, the question was, what do I do with it? And then once I asked, what do I do with it? I found that there was a big opportunity to do things with it, right? Like, and that's where my pivot went. Um, I'm fortunate where I didn't have a very diverse cap table, so I didn't have to have those hard discussions. And it's been a big opportunity, and I see a lot of demand both from a customer side, the people that want CO2 and hydrogen, and on the other side of people who have giant waste piles. The difficulty that I've run into is capital doesn't always meet customer demand, and customer demand doesn't always meet where capital is. So
yeah.
how how do you bridge that gap of capital and demand, and also the difficult decision in pivoting so that you get closer to capital and demand?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, great questions. And I first of all congratulate you on the fact that you made like that leap and that pivot, and you had the sort of foresight to do that. I think that that naturally shows to me there's like a an entrepreneurial inclination there to like seek out and find that greater opportunity and not be willing to get too stuck in your ideas. I think a lot of us do. We get kind of so baked on what we imagine this thing is going to be like that we find it so exhausting to like have to like go back a step. And the startup world honestly is a bit like, in England we call it snakes and ladders, and I think in America you guys call it shoots and ladders. But it's that game, right? Like so much of it is like you take 5 steps forward and then suddenly like, oh no, you have to go back, back to the square. And there are squares that will put you all the way back to the beginning again where you've got to start fresh with a new blank canvas and work your way forward. But each time you go back to the beginning, you get more experience than you were before. So it's not a true game of shoots and ladders where you're just rolling dice because you get better at navigating and learning to avoid the previous shoots that you've been down. Um, and you find more ladders through the networks that you get to build. And that ladder approach is really what takes us to sort of the financing and the capital that's out there. Because it's interesting, like listening to you speak about it, you're like, well, there isn't the capital that's out there for the good ideas. And I would push back again and be pretty contentious and say, like, nope, there is tons of money out there for great ideas. Like there is like if you've got an idea that's going to bring a return, there is an abundance of money out there for it. Like especially in the US, there is just like money falling from trees everywhere for great ideas. Like
I
this is not a problem of like finding money for great ideas. So much of it is a problem of like how do you communicate that across to that? How do you communicate that idea across those people? How do you find those people to connect with? And do that work, efficiently and effectively with the time that you have, right? How do you get those ladders that take you to those places? But if you've got a real business and a really good idea, then there is absolute opportunities there. Now, saying that, understand that on the other end of that and where that ladder leads to is that for some of those people they're looking for very specific types of returns, and venture capital as an example because we talked about it, you know probably in the hardware deep tech space, don't quote me on this but I guess I'm saying it on a podcast, probably fits maybe about 3 or 4% of all the companies that really sit in that space. That's probably what venture capital actually fits. There's a few companies that are super high growth with you know 10 to 30x like return opportunities, But modern majority of the companies that sit in that space are doing really important, really world changing work. They may be building a better new energy technology or helping, as you said, like redivert a waste stream and turning it into a new feedstock. But their return multiples might be more in the more modest, 3 or 4x, which might be perfect for like an angel investor, or a family office, but not relevant for like a venture capital. And yet, because venture capital spends all their time advertising and they're seeing at all the events, they're the ones everyone's chasing when automatically they tell you up front, look, we look at 1,000 deals a year where we make like, 20 investments. It's like, well, then why are you putting yourself in the pool of the other 99 point something percent companies that aren't going to get invested in? Go talk to the other guys who like, that's what they're focused on. And that's kind of how I see it. I see it as like a game of shoots and ladders to some experience where you can leverage people with connections and with networks to take those ladders and go meet the people that really are going to invest in it. But if you have a real business and a really good idea, there's absolutely money out there. But these days, it's becoming more than just having an idea. You need to be able to demonstrate some real traction and do things in a sort of methodical way. And unfortunately, that often means like build up at a very small scale and then do the next stage and do the next stage. There's a lot of hoop jumping, unfortunately, with the deep tech hardware world. And that's because there's just a lot of caution that exists there. Because unfortunately, there has been a lot of money around, as we've seen in the past, Andy, and people have burned through a lot of money chasing really big dreams that haven't paid out. And investors and all classes have become a lot more wary, and therefore want to see that traction, slow and steady.
I agree. I wasn't saying that there wasn't capital for this. I was just saying in many cases you can build up traction and you can build up demand, but getting that story
Mm.
to marry with the thesis of an investor is very different. And as you kind of hit on, the thesis of the investors matters quite a bit. And so, and sometimes they use that thesis as a way to just say, okay, you don't fit this box, and so we have so many deals in our pipeline, you're just not there, right? And I think the difficulty that we have going forward for a lot of these companies that are in the space is, again, matchmaking. How do we find the right people who are willing to take a risk to bring that vision to life? And in startup world, that is exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an exciting part of it, though, right? Like to be part of a sort of world where so many people are have so many dreams, and they're openly sharing those dreams with one another, and they're more than dreams. Sometimes they have real, credible ambition and motivation, and real purposeful. But in all of that, they need to build new organizations, like hire more people, and they're always going to have some sort of limits on that, right? Be it capital restrictions because they need money to do certain things, like human capital restrictions, right? But there's always going to be a resource-based, limited environment to sort of grow that. Some things take off and other things don't, and like trying to predict which ones those are. That's again what the professional investors spend their entire time focusing on as they look into that world. And I really admire the fact they do that, right? Like I admire that they there is a whole community of people out there that spend their entire time trying to figure out like who's going to win, who's not, who's going to get things done. When from the outside perspective, or I mean, I'm somewhat inside it, but even then, from that perspective, sometimes I couldn't know where to place bets, and I would not feel I wouldn't feel that I have the nerves to make any significant investments in a lot of startups because it's just so hard to predict because there's so many other things that can go wrong and awry, and like as you said, macroeconomic factors can tie in, and yet we continue to do it, and like there are some winners in these various businesses, and opportunities come about. And what I do see is that like we are getting more and more mature across the startup ecosystems where we can have conversations like this one today and talk at fairly advanced levels about like different stage gating of funds. We can talk about the different sort of like variations of capital. We can talk about like how we can talk openly about like learnings and lessons learned from failures as well as successes. I mean, this stuff is really really great, right? Like and we should be not too hard on ourselves that you know 20 years ago the startup industry didn't even really exist.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to lead us to our next question that is super important. What are you waiting for?
Yeah, I love that question. That's what we love this podcast for. I mean, I I have I'm waiting for a moment where we're able to really bridge what it means to be a founder and the emotional like roller coaster that is, and recognizing those people in society and in the important role they have in the creation of change and the creation of opportunities and jobs for so many others, um, matched with some of the technologies that are like driving towards positive social and environmental impact and purpose, right? I feel like we've had a huge draw to new technologies, sometimes for the sake of technology, in the same reason that I got into my first entrepreneur endeavors as a kid, because I saw a new thing and it got me kind of excited. And sometimes you can chase that and build software that can like help optimize things and do cool new things, but doing cool new things, although it's part of that progress, should hopefully have like a drive back towards purpose. So what I'm waiting for is the moment when we really have socially responsible corporate businesses growing and building world class startup environments that then grow into these big mega corporations that have that, let's call it B core kind of mindset from the very get go. And I think that is something that I've been waiting for, and I hope to see more of. I mean, we have some models of it across the US. I don't want to say there are none, but if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, I think there are a couple in there that are trying to sort of register as B Corps, but there really hasn't been a huge migration that way. And at the small sort of startup level, there is an interest in that space, but often the social and environmental purpose and impact gets sort of mitigated by the fact of I just need to survive in a commercial environment and somebody else is going to undercut me, so therefore I need to prioritize those things, which is very important and definitely true, but simultaneously like it's sort of like holding us back as a society to be making the positive social and environmental change that we could be making.
So, Nigel, I that was great. What you asked for is actually something that we talked about multiple times in previous podcasts here. But what you're really talking about is a governance model of social responsibility to address problems, right? And we
I'm talking about the nuance there of that and the founder mindset that goes with it. The roller coaster being so rough that sometimes people are like just holding on for dear life in the founder seat. They're holding on to that roller coaster for dear life that they will switch and fly whichever way it's going. Like for example, hey, there's more money in defense right now. Okay, let's take more money from defense. As opposed to, wait a minute, we're the founders. Like we get to decide where the world is going to go, and we get to like actually shape and drive where the track of this roller coaster actually is going to go, because in the end all of the people that feed off of the founders, right? And when I talk about the feeders, I mean like the VC groups, the investors, the various like customer segments we sort of feed into, right? All of those people are beholden to the founders to create these new technologies to drive the world in a certain direction, and they actually have the control, but it doesn't feel like it when they need the capital and they need the things because they're willing to jump that other person's hoop and mitigate and and move in that direction. And so what I mean is what I'm waiting for is that moment where the founders really take control of the driving seat and move the world in the direction that like makes the biggest social and environmental impact and change.
I completely agree. We'll have to have you come back at a later date and talk through our organizational design because I think it would uh it hits every single thing that you just mentioned.
I'm super excited about what you're doing, Andy. Like, I mean, yeah, it's just
It
so necessary that like we look at the world and we realize that one person's waste is another person's feedstock. There are so many opportunities in those frames, and then we build good teams and good cultures around that. The standards are shifting. The current generation and the upcoming generations don't want things to be the same way they were before. Yes, we got privileged that we got to grow up and see the technology radically change things, and we're seeing that yet again. Um, but we've also seen the changes that are happening in our environment. We've seen the changes that are happening in society, and we're recognizing there's opportunities to shift that direction. And I'm a big believer and a big backer of founders that want to make those things happen. And that's how we got introduced. And yeah, really look forward to following the journey and seeing where you go with it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We've had Nigel Sharp on. This has been another episode of What Are You Waiting For? A podcast by Godot. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nigel, again. This has been great.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, really appreciate it.
See ya.